How do we get our lives sorted out? Where do we start to do that? And what might it mean to follow God's guidance as we do it? Well, let's go back 2,000 years to the banks of the River Jordan to explore these questions. You bunch of snakes. Well, that was the opening line when John the Baptist spoke to people in first century Palestine who went out to the desert to hear him. Today, we'd probably think he needs to get his PR sorted out. But here's the interesting thing. Crowds of people travelled out into the desert to hear John. John was a complete maverick. He worked outside mainstream society. He wore animal skins instead of normal cloth. He spoke his mind bluntly to whoever was in his hearing. Well, that didn't work out well for John because when he did that with King Herod, unsurprisingly, he got executed. Yet this strange man out in the desert by the Jordan with his powerful message, telling people to get their life sorted out, drew the crowds. They knew what they were going to get. And they still turned up. Here we see people hungry for direction in life. They wanted the truth to be told to them. So they go to John to ask that deep existential question to which we all need to keep returning. How shall I live? Let's read about John as recorded in the Gospel of Luke. Crowds of people came out to be baptized. But John said to them, "You bunch of snakes, who warned you to run from the coming judgment? Do something to show that you really have given up your sins. Don't start saying that you belong to Abraham's family. God can turn these stones into children for Abraham. An axe is ready to cut down the trees at their roots. Any tree that doesn't produce good fruit will be cut down and thrown into a fire." The crowds asked John, "What should we do?" John told them, "If you have 2 coats, give one to someone who doesn't have any. If you have food, share it with someone else." When tax collectors came to be baptized, they asked John, "Teacher, what should we do?" John told them, "Don't make people pay more than they owe." Some soldiers asked him, "What about us? What do we have to do?" John told them, "Don't force people to pay money to make you leave them alone. Be satisfied with your pay." Everyone became excited and wondered, could John be the Messiah? Let's strip these questions down then to their most general form and therefore make them applicable to everyone. Here we are in roles in society in which it's very easy to live badly. It's very easy to live in a way which is morally questionable. What are we supposed to do about it? And let's move from the banks of the Jordan in the 1st century to people listening to this video in the 21st century. And we can say essentially the same thing. Here we are in a society in which it's very easy to live badly, very easy to merely conform to those around us. We're surrounded by bad stuff with which we feed our bodies and minds. Our society puts demands on us which are morally questionable. What are we supposed to do about it? How are we supposed to live? In his answers, we see John being very down to earth and practical. Very importantly, he's not expecting them to walk out on their job, drop out and live an alternative life, holy and pure, outside the corruption of mainstream society. Now, some people at the time had done this and they'd become disciples of John. There were devout Jews living out in the desert called Essenes. And when we think of Jesus' disciples, we tend to think of those who had left their jobs, whatever that was, fisherman, tax collector, revolutionary, not quite a job, but it's what they did, and then simply followed Jesus in his travelling around. And very obviously, there have been people since then who've done this. Well, some of you listening to this video may in the future do this. But very obviously, the vast majority of those who heard John and then subsequently heard Jesus and responded because they were profoundly moved by what he said, they didn't drop out. They stayed where they were to try and put into practice the teachings they had heard from him. And that's what I want to reflect on today. We are where we are and likely to remain so. So what does John say in response to their question? Very importantly, we don't have John giving nice platitudes, patting people on the head, affirming them in what they're doing, massaging their egos and self-esteem. So let's engage with this message of John as if we're listening on the banks of the Jordan in the 1st century. Our starting point, we're a bunch of snakes. Each one of us needs to be totally real about who we are, to face up to the reality of who we are. Because without this realism, there's no chance we're going to get a grip on our lives and then courageously do something about it. So what is John's message to the people who came to the Jordan to hear him and then to us today? Essentially it is stay put, clean up your act, take responsibility for your own actions, take a courageous stand and go the way you know is right, not merely the way that is in the short term expedient and keeps everybody around you happy, and do your job properly. To those who are comfortably off, John's message was, well, give some of it away. You have the capacity to utterly transform the lives of the poor. Today there are countries where £500 will pay for a year, even as a boarder, at a school for a child. This is life transforming for that child, and they can then be transformative in the communities in which they live. Let's translate the tax collector advice into today's term. It's not a question of what you can manage to get away with, of finding loopholes, of cutting corners, but of what is right. And behaving like this could, of course, make you unpopular with others in your profession. Soldiers in the Roman Empire could do essentially what they wanted to all but the most wealthy of the local population. So again, it's a call to live well, to show a courageous individuality in the face of peer pressure, and not to base our actions on what we can get away with, but on what we know is right. What about young people in education? Unfortunately, we don't have John's actual words here because that was a category which just didn't exist in 1st century Palestine. But we can make some intelligent guesses based on what he told others. Now, he's not going to paint grand visions of students solving the world's environmental problems. He's going to tell you to ensure that your own crisp packet ends up in the bin and not blowing around the school or college grounds. He'll want you to start where you are with the small and simple that you can courageously get a grip on. Well, how about greater use of please and thank you, especially with your parents. Get a grip on your screen time. Work out how you should be using social media appropriately. How much credibility is your grand vision for peace in the Middle East, or redistribution of wealth to eliminate poverty, or sorting out the climate crisis, if you're not focused enough to hand in your essays on time? So what would John be saying to you guys? He said, grow up, get a grip on the small things of life. When you get home, put your clothes on a hanger. Don't just drop them on the floor-drobe. Now, that in itself is not a big deal, but such behaviour is powerful symbolically. Most importantly, symbolically to yourself. A very important aspect of any personal change then is start where you are. Start small and start with something you can actually do. If you keep doing this for a year, you'll be really surprised at the results. So the message John gave to those men who went to hear him is as valid now as it was 2,000 years ago. For most people, following the call of God is not about giving up everything and following Jesus as the 12 disciples did. Rather, it's about staying put, get a grip on your life, and living courageously and honestly with integrity in all that you do.